Thank you, everybody, for coming. I had to get up very early this morning to come here. I got up at 3:30, to catch the flight to come here, right? I'm very tired. And I'm not just talk about my book. I want to tell you my love story. And when I teach in classroom, tell my students that actually it's possible for people to work together to solve their problems, to improve their lives together. Most of my students said, I don't believe you. I say, you don't need to believe me, right? Because you have very, very different life experience. And in America, most people believe human nature are selfish, right? And people are born selfish, they only care about themselves. They will not want to work unless they are forced to work. That's most Americans believe. So at Warren Wilson College, we have a work day. So every year on March 8th, it's a Wednesday normally, everybody come out to do some project on campus. About the majority of people come out, faculty, staff, students come out to work together. We do that every year. It's a big event on campus. And when I tell my students during the cultural years, 17 million people, young people in the urban area, volunteer to work in the countryside with farmers. Students said, I don't believe that. Right? It must be between a gun and work. Must be between gun. I said, why in China had to be between gun and work? Here, on the work day, we all came out to work. You don't have to have a gun, because our nature, if we have a nature, we want to work. We are what we are through working together. Right? When I tell my students the welfare program in this country actually deprive these people's humanity, they don't understand why. If a person can no longer work, do you think he's still human? There are many, many people began to think they become trash, they become burden on society. They lose their self-confidence, they lose their own dignity. Work is very important. Work is made what we are. I had a colleague one time, he invited me to his classroom to talk about Mao and communism. And when I came to class, he said, Dongping, give me 1 minute. Let me get my class in order, then I'll attend to you. And he forgot I was there. He began to talk about Mao and Stalin, how they control society. He said something shocked me. He said Mao and Stalin will send people into the streets, neighborhood, and randomly shoot people. That's how Mao and Stalin controlled society. That's a professor of political science. I was so shocked. But no students in the classroom raised any question about that. That's how American students are taught about socialism and communism, right? And I grew up in the countryside. Both of my parents were illiterate. And before I went to school, most of my cousins and the children who were older than I was were not in school. And during the cultural years, the Chinese government empowered Chinese farmers to set up their own schools. The Chinese elites today were telling the Chinese people and telling the world the Cultural Revolution was a national disaster, and during which time education suffered tremendously. The truth of the story is, actually, the Cultural Revolution expanded educational reach to the countryside. And I did my research mostly in my own county, Jima County in Shandong Province. Before the Cultural Revolution years, there was only one high school in my county. There were 750,000 people in my county at the time. And the high school had only 2 classes each year. Each class had 30 students. So each year, only 60 students from that county were able to go to high school. Before the Cultural Revolution, 17 years before the Cultural Revolution, their high school only graduated 1,500 high school students. 800 of them left the village, left the countryside to go to college, and 700 others mostly go to work in the urban area. So there were 1,050 villages in my county. Most villages didn't have one high school student at the time. During the Cultural years, during the 10 years, so-called national disaster, my county built 89 high schools. From 1 to 89 in 10 years' time. Before the Cultural Revolution, we have 7 middle schools in the county. By the end of 1976, we had 249 middle schools. Every village had a primary school. Everybody were able to go to school free of charge, without exams. It's become an entitlement. Everybody was allowed to go to school free. And in China, there are many, many scholars talking about school should be run by teachers or professional educators. But I think if you allow professors, you allow professional teachers to manage education, education always suffer. For a very good reason. Because the teachers think first about their own self-interest. That's what happens. They try to make education, they make education was so, right, to become their own privilege. They didn't want many more people to receive the education. I looked through Chinese record. Every time professional educators are in charge of education, education suffer. The only time exception is during the cultural years, when the farmers, when the workers were empowered to run their own school, and school flourished. And the poor people, the working class people, have real access to education. And I was telling my son, I was so lucky I was growing up during the cultural years, because the educational model at the time was so different. It was not like today in China. Students were burdened with exams every day, every week. And there were no weekends for Chinese students. Why? Because they need to prepare themselves to pass the different exams all the time. And the school, the teachers are measured by the number of students they were able to send to college, not about how much students learned actually. And during the cultural years, not only school expanded greatly, but also the format, the way of education was carried out is very, very much transformed. The students, when I was in middle school, was empowered to writing their own textbook. We go to the factories, we talk with the workers, engineers, we write a book on how to repair farm machines, internal capacity engines, how they were made, how they should be repaired. if something wrong. We talk with the farmers and develop our own textbook on agriculture. I remember talking about my garden at Warren Wilson College, because I was taught when I was in middle school, in high school, and how to farm, how to grow things. Every class in high school, in middle school, has an experiment field. And it's a part of our job every week to go to our garden, to look after our vegetables, to learn how to grow, how to plant, how to take care of. It's become a part of my nature. And now I grew about most of my own vegetables. Over the year, I grew about 40 kinds of vegetables and grain. I grew soybeans, corn, tomatoes, potatoes, everything. I do that at Warren Wilson College, try to demonstrate to the community how much you can do if you really care about the environment, right? So when I was growing up in the school system, there were no exams almost. There were no exams. The examination, if we had one, is always open book. And students were allowed to talk to each other, to discuss, to copy from each other. If you didn't know before, you copied from others, you learned, right? That's the most idea on exam. Yeah, before the Cultural Revolution, many teachers used the grade, used the marks as an instrument to control students in the classroom. And during the cultural years, that part was taken away. The students empowered to debate, discuss with teachers on the equal footing. I learned so much from that format of education. When I first came to the United States, and I attended University of Vermont, I was working for my master's of history. One of my professors had a class on Cultural Revolution. And in the class, everybody said the Cultural Revolution was an educational disaster. I was so angered. I said, okay, I was a product of the Cultural Revolution, right? Any one of you want to come out? Let's have the competition, see who knows more, right? None of them dare to compete with me, right? None of them dare to. So that discussion about the cultural as disaster was ended there. And there are many Chinese young people grown up with that perception, the culture is a failure. But the truth of the matter, the Cultural Revolution trained a generation of people like myself, not only empowered with books knowledge, but with a lot of knowledge about society, about the real productive work. And I think China, the reason China was able to develop so well in the first 30 years, and I think by comparison, even China today, even though I think that China has a lot of problems, still China did much better than most other third world countries. Many people in this country, or in the world, like to pick on China. But they don't know how big progress China made over the 60 years, right? And there are a lot of scholars in this country talking about China when they talk about, you see, the famine in 1960, the Great Forward. They didn't know famine was commonplace in China before the Chinese Revolution. There are famine every year. There are bandits everywhere. They didn't know how, because Chinese Revolution, famine become very rare and only happened once, right? And it's because 100 years, unprecedented natural disaster in 100 years. The worst drought and the worst flooding in that 3 years. Yes, we had grain shortages. But because the Communist government took very good care of the Chinese people. We actually didn't have a widespread famine during that 3 years. We had a lot of hunger, but most people survived. One of my professors got a huge grant, Guggenheim, to study the famine in China. I went with him. And his thesis want to prove how badly miserable the communist revolution was for the Chinese people. Want to prove it's failed. But most farmers told him, without the government support, more people would have died. That's actually very, very true. In my hometown, during the famine, I was 5 years old when the Great Forward famine took place. My village was able to eat the dried wild vegetables from Yunnan province, southern China, 3,000–4,000 miles away. So the government shipped wild vegetables and relief grain from far away to help people survive. So the communist government did a lot for the Chinese people. And partly because I think that the communist government enabled the people to work together, to organize them, and to work as a community, not just work for themselves. And I was talking with Larry on the way here. And 2 days ago, one of the Chinese most famous scientists, he was a rocket scientist. He used to teach in this country, in California, Institute of Technology of California. And in 1949, when the communists came to power, he wanted to go back. And the American government, the Secretary of the Navy said, I would rather kill him than allow him to go back, because his knowledge is worth 5 divisions. So eventually they arrested him for 15 days, then house arrested him for 5 years. Eventually he went back in 1955, and he helped China develop the rocket program. The satellite was sent to space in 1971, was done by him and his colleagues. He became very, very famous in China. Everybody knew him. When he died, most people in China, particularly scientists, demanded the Chinese government give him a state funeral. But the government didn't do it. Why? Because he said something I don't think the current government liked him. He said he was excited only 3 times in his life. The first time was when he got back to China after 5 years of house arrest. The second time, in 1958, he was able to join the Communist Party. The third time was when the Chinese government in the early 50s ranked him as one of the 5 people moved to China. All the 4 others were workers, farmers, and soldiers. And he said he was very excited because he was able to be ranked as one of the person with a worker, with a farmer. That's what China was like. The intellectuals would consider it's a big honor to be ranked with the working class. People not work for themselves, for their own rank, for their own honors, but to work to how to make the community, make the nation better. And in 1985, the new Chinese government, Deng Xiaoping's government, gave him a big honor as the scientist who made the most contribution to the Chinese science and technology. When he got that honor, he said he was not excited. Yeah, because the only 3 times excited, he just mentioned that, right? And he also said something very, very well, made me think a lot. He said, if China abandoned socialism, if China abandoned modern thought, Chinese nation will suffer, and the Chinese state will fail. At the time when he said that, most people didn't think very hard about what he meant. Looking back today, I think he was right. This summer, I was in Xinjiang, where the words rise. I mentioned in my radio interview this afternoon. I was there on July 3rd, and the riots broke out on July 5th. And it really, really shocked me to see 50,000 people came out with big knives and axes, began to kill people. I never thought China had ethnic problem like that. And I thought a lot afterwards. I don't think that's an ethnic problem. It's a class clash. And most people said, even the people who were trying to kill the Han Chinese, and the Han Chinese tried to kill the ethnic Uyghurs. It's not that simple. You know, the Xinjiang area is a minority region where the Uyghurs live. There are 13 minority people living in Xinjiang. The Uyghurs are one of the biggest. In the old days, when the enterprises in Xinjiang was owned by the state, in China we call it all people's ownership. When the state ran these enterprises, they made sure the Uyghur people were treated equally. They get equal employment opportunity. They got the same pay. They got the same benefit like the Chinese, Han Chinese, like myself. And the Han Chinese and the ethnic minority work together very well, like brothers. I was so moved when I was in Xinjiang this summer. On the one hand, the Uyghurs were killing Chinese. There were a lot of old Uyghurs came out, shaking hands with Chinese. Were telling us, you know, we are brothers. We are brothers. And the people who are killing people are only minorities. Right? Of course, it's not that simple. The reason why the old Uyghurs were able to tell the Han Chinese they were brothers, because they lived in the socialist time. They really work together like brothers, care about each other like brothers. But today, it's a different story. In the last 30 years, most state-owned enterprises were privatized. The guy who was in charge of Xinjiang was a guy from my hometown, Shandong province. And his name is Wang Lequan. He had been #1 leader in Xinjiang for 18 years. During this time, most state-owned enterprises become private property, and mostly owned by people from my province, actually. So the private capitalists from Shandong province had a very, very different hiring practice. They would hire Chinese from my province first. If they couldn't find any Chinese from my province to work for them, they hired Chinese from other provinces. So the Uyghur people couldn't get employment anymore. If they did get a job, they were treated very, very differently, because they didn't speak the same language, because they didn't have the same culture. So they were mistreated, right? So they have a resentment against the rich Han Chinese, #1. #2, in the old days, when the resources in Xinjiang were developed, it was developed for the benefit of whole Chinese people. And today, because these developers were the capitalists, they developed these resources for their own benefit. And the Xinjiang people had resentment against that too. That's why they rioted. The reason I see this is important is because I think this thing can happen anywhere in China. The class clash, the class contradiction in China has been intensified, and the capitalism. I think there is no way China will be able to survive along this capitalist path. The Chinese government tried very hard to suppress people's discussion of the Cultural Revolution. They didn't allow people to talk about it. I think the reason they were able to get away because the government never, Deng Xiaoping said, we will not discuss that issue. That's what happened in China. But as things become more and more, the gap between the rich and poor become bigger and bigger, I don't think the Chinese government's ability to suppress this will be very, very long. And Larry this afternoon asked me, there are mosques in China? Yes, of course there are mosques in China. The majority of Chinese people are moist. Why? The working class, the farmers, the workers, who enjoyed free education, free medical care, lifelong job security, want to get their benefit back. Every year I take students to China. They were always amazed to see the long lines outside mosque lane. The Chinese working class still have fond memories of the Cultural Revolution, of the socialist practice in China. And I think I'll stop here. If you have any questions.
Again, I want to thank everyone for coming out. What we're going to do is open it up to questions, and I was going to kick it off with one question to you and then let the audience speak. We're going to have microphones. That's while we get the microphones all ready, going out among people, so you should raise your hand. And also, if there's anyone that wants to write up a question and send it forward, they can do that too. So again, just one question I wanted to ask is maybe you could give us sort of a on-the-ground picture of the kind of the new values that were being created in the village in which you lived. In other words, how did people actually change their thinking about each other and caring for each other? Or how was it that it became a community? And what was the sense of responsibility? Or did it change? And maybe you could give some illustrations about how the values of people, went through changes during the Cultural Revolution.
Okay. I always believe the so-called human nature is a product of the social climate and the social institutions. We are what we are because the social institutions in society. And the thing what changed the Cultural Revolution, changed the people's mindset or their behavior during the Cultural Revolution years is because people, the government, and the community care about each other. And in this country, the reason why we're selfish is because nobody cares about us. If we don't care about ourselves, nobody will care about you. But during the cultural years, in the socialist climate, you don't need to care about yourself. Other people will care about you. They will care about you as much as they care about themselves. I remember I told you a story one time. Is my friend, and he was 2 years older than I was, He's a very, very smart person. But he had a problem. He couldn't get up in the morning. There are a lot of young people like that. I couldn't get up myself too. I was able to get up because my father wake me up every morning. So every morning I came out to work. And one day, this friend of mine didn't come out. The production team leader said, Dongping, go to wake him up. So I went to wake him up. I yelled at him outside his house. The first day, he answered. Oh, I'll be there in a minute, right? And he came out the first day. The second day, the production team leader said, go to wake him up. So I yelled, he didn't answer. I came back to the leader and said, he didn't even answer this morning. Go in, wake him up. So I went in his house. And his grandma said, the child needs sleep. His grandma was very cold at the time. So I came back told the leader. So his grandma was upset. And the leader said, don't mind about his grandma. Go to wake him up. So I could drag him up from the bed. And I did that almost every day when I was in the village. And this guy is a very, very intelligent person. When he was up working with us, he worked very hard. Right? He worked very hard, so every day we drag him along. And he did fine. He was very, very popular with his peers because he knew how to play instrument, and he was able to tell jokes, things like that. He did very well, get married. A lady, he was very, very handsome, very, very tall. And he liked to drag me in front of the mirror to show. He was taller than I am, he was more handsome than I am. But that's what he was socially not smart, or awkward. But in 1982, when the land was divided up, when the collective was disbanded, nobody woke him up anymore. And he got into a problem. And his wife left him. And he became developing mental problems. This is my belief. If a person was deprived his right to work together with others, he will develop mental problem. Right? So he was sick. So in 1998, I went back home to the village again. I saw a person walking naked on the street in the distance. I said, that's him. So I was running after him. He saw me, he ran back home. And I followed him into his house. I said, Daying, that's you? Naked? Walking naked on the street? He said, yes. I don't want to leave. Life's not good. I'm miserable, right? So I tried, I said, you see, Daying, don't think negatively. Think about the positive things, right? Why couldn't you, right, start something new? I said, you see, there are a lot of people in the village play instrument, right, at night. Why don't you join them? You are very good with your instrument, right? I said, don't want to see any people. Don't want to see others. I said, you can paint. You used to be very, very good painter. I said, well, remember you were able to paint horses very well, right? Why don't you paint? He said, no, I just don't want to do anything like that. I said, I'll be in the village for another 10 days. I want to buy a painting from you, so do one for me. He said, okay, I'll do one for you. And the next day he came to my house. He said, Dongping, no, I cannot do it. Give me 1 year. Next year when you come back, I'll give you a painting. I told him, I said, I'm not interested in your painting. I'm more interested in you. I want you really to stand up, to live like a person, right? He said, yeah, I promise you, I will. But after I came back home here, 3 months later, my sister wrote to me, said he committed suicide. And when I read my sister's letter, I cried for a long time. I knew if the collective didn't disband, And if the village was still working, live as a community, somebody will help him along. And he will not need to kill himself. But nobody cares after the collective was disbanded. I want to say a few more things about that, right? The reason why Chinese society became like that during the socialist time is because people care about each other. If you have a problem, the village community will come to help you. And I will tell tell Lincoln this afternoon, when my father worked at the time, whenever he was sick, the factory management will use their only truck to come to my village to pick him up, to send him to the hospital. When people got married, for example, very young people, before they knew, the village management will give him some grain, some money to help him to establish a new home, a new family. So it's the kind of, the workers were being cared by the management. In return, the workers return their loyalty to the management. That's not a tradition. That's the socialism. And whenever it rains in my village, for example, you don't need to wake people up. Everybody rush to the collective threshing ground to take care of the grain, the public collected grain there. When it snowed, everybody came out to clean the street without asking. This is how the community work. When I was in primary school, every morning I get up 1 hour early with 3 other classmates to go to the classroom, to clean the classroom, to start a fire. And that kind of public spirit was never asked by the teacher or anybody. Nobody had assigned to do it. We don't tell anybody, but we just feel it's a good thing that we did something for the community, for the collective. So it's a social climate that made China what it was like during the time. Okay.
Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to take one question from the audience, and then I'll read one question. We've got a number that have been passed up. So let's start one from the audience and wait until the microphone reaches you. There's someone in the yellow shirt back there.
Yes, thank you. I'd just like to know what you see to be the essential elements for the creation of a constructive social revolution. What are the foundation pieces of a revolution that ends up being constructive for the people engaged in it?
Okay. I think that has a lot to do with Mao's writing and Mao's aspiration as a revolutionary. I don't know whether you ever heard of Mao's writing called Serve the People. And most American scholars writing about Mao's ideas, right? They think Mao's idea is very, very loose and very, very hard to grasp. And I think for the Chinese people, for people like me, people like my mom, my father, who were illiterate, Mao's language is unbelievably easy to understand. And there's one famous Chinese linguist. He said Mao's writing is very, very unique. For scholars, his writing is very, very high style. But at the same time, it's the language common people can understand. And I can still recite Mao's article, that one, to serve people. And that article itself, most people don't understand what communism is about. From Mao's perspective, a communist is somebody who's dedicated for the service to the common people. The reason why the Communist Party, Communist Revolution in China was so fascinating is because they believe they are sacrificed themselves to liberate 95% of the Chinese people, they are working not for their own benefit, but to work to make sure the oppressed, the exploited, get what they deserve in society. I think that's the central thing made the Chinese Revolution different from other revolutions. Number one. Number two, the Cultural Revolution started with the studying of Mao's writings. And most people, I told them in my book, in China, before the Cultural Revolution, many village leaders, county leaders, behave in some way a little bit different from the traditional officials. But in many ways, very, very similar. Their working styles very, very similar to traditional officials. And the Cultural Revolution started by teaching the Chinese working class Mao's writings. There are many Chinese farmers began to read Mao's writings. And they began to realize Mao's vision, Mao's idea about socialism is very, very different from what's going on in China, right? And officials, according to Mao's idea, need to work with the working class people. They need to share hardship with the people. And during the current years, they developed a very, very different standard. For example, county magistrator, who used to be a very, very big official in the county, right, were asked to work with farmers 200 days a year. You will see, that time you saw county officials on bikes every day working with the villagers in the field. And the community leaders were asked to work 300 days a year. And the village leader was supposed to work with farmers almost every day, except when they need to go to meetings. So that's how it's a comprehensive transformation. I mean, today many people write about cultural revolution, talking about how the government persecute intellectuals by asking them to work with farmers, right? But at times, under their social climate, there are many people who are seeing there's persecution today. At that time, thought the revolution empowered them as well to come out their university to work with farmers. They considered it was revolution as well. You know, professors, doctors used to only work in urban area. Now the government encouraged them, right, to integrate with the working class. So it's a different social climate. I think it's not one thing, it's many other things, but it's a social climate of working for others as honor, as a really great honor to be able to help others and to do selfless things for the community and for the public. That's what happened.
Here's a question. Drugs are a huge problem here in the United States. Could you discuss about how drug addiction was dealt with in the People's Republic of China during the socialist period? Yeah.
And when I was in college, almost every year invited some scholars to come to talk about the drug issues. Americans are fighting drug war in Latin America, right? And I one time I raised the question to the scholar. I said, you know, if you are really serious about getting rid of drugs, then we need socialism. Right? It's true. Why people use drugs? People have mental problems sometimes. They have too much stress in their lives. They worry about losing their job. They worry about their children getting adequate education, medical care. They worry about losing their house, right? And the socialist system solved all these problems. The workers during the socialist time had lifelong job security. They never need to worry about losing their jobs. The factory, the workers consider their own factory. When my father, I was telling you, linking this on too, my father was sick in the 70s. He had a breathing problem. So when he caught cold, he was breathing very hard. On the Chinese New Year, the Chinese society usually closed for about 7 days. So every factory was closed for 7 days as holidays. But my father always insisted he need to be the guard for the factory when other workers go home to celebrate. One time I told him, why you need to go? I can go for you. He said, no. You can go with me, but you cannot replace me. I have to go. He just cared about his factory because the factory was his, right? And one time I had a debate with the Chinese students, and he said, the biggest joke in under the heaven, under the sky, was when Chinese government said the workers, farmers are the master of state. I said, why it's a joke? He said the workers, farmers didn't become master. I said, why? When nobody could fight them. When they could decide whether they want to work or not, don't you think they were masters? Nobody could fire workers anymore. Even a worker refused to work. The factory cannot fire him. Why? One time Mao said, if a worker refuses to work, there must be something wrong with the management. Because a worker naturally wants to work. Don't you think that's true? If a worker refuses to work, there must be something wrong with the management. You think we're hard. That's very true. Right? That's why Mao allowed workers to strike. Workers should have a right to strike. Right? And this is very, very important. When people have work, when people have no danger of losing their house, medical care, when their children were taken care of, all the stress in their life was removed. When we live in a community, when you need help, your friends, your colleagues will help you. Why do you need to use drugs? People use drugs for a reason. The people who use drugs in this country, for example, are mostly distressed, need help. But we treat them as criminals, right? And of course, I think this issue is a philosophical issue as well, right?
All right, we'll call on, let's see, hands, and we'll get the mics circulating about. So, can I see? Oh, okay, you want to ask a question here? Okay.
So, Professor, from my understanding, you were very young when you started or were part of organizing a Red Guard unit in your village, and you were saying that I read that there's a lot of newspapers going around and everyone was writing and publishing and debating. So as a young person during the time, what was some of the subjects, if you can remember, that people were widely debating?
The Cultural Revolution, I'll always consider the Cultural Revolution as an empowerment movement. And some Chinese scholars, somebody asked you just a few before my talk, somebody asked me, said, Mao tried use the Cultural Revolution to consolidate his own power, right? And I don't agree with that. I think Mao's power is very, very solid at the time when he started the Cultural Revolution. It was so solid. Nobody in China at the time. I mean, most people didn't understand. The reason why Mao was so popular, so powerful, not because the government didn't allow people to criticize Mao. Because your neighbor, your friends, will not tolerate you criticizing Mao. Why? Because Mao's policies represented the best interest of Chinese working class, 90% of them. If you criticize Mao, you criticizing them. You are hurting them. So they will not allow you to talk about that. The reason I said the Cultural Revolution was empowerment is Mao began to say, if the working class not empowered to take control of the state, then the revolutionary accomplishment the Chinese Revolution achieved, right, could be taken away by the elites very easily. I'm not just telling from, my own speculation. Actually, there's evidence to prove. Mao wrote on the margin of there's a book he was reading, the Soviet Political Economy textbook. And in that textbook, he talked about how the workers in a socialist society enjoy the free medical care, enjoy the right to work, and enjoy many, many things, right? But Mao said on the margin, if the working class people don't control the state, all the socialist benefit could be taken away by the elites. That's proved in China already, right? So I think the Cultural Revolution was made to empower the working class, to empower the people, to take the state matters into their own hands. And Mao said the Cultural Revolution was for people to educate themselves, to empower themselves. So he was willing to go through all the chaotic period in the beginning, allow the young people to criticize their leaders. Let me tell you what I did when I was 11 years old at the time. And I felt so empowered because Mao said, students can criticize their teacher, can criticize the principal. And I wrote 2 big character posters when I was only in 3rd grade. Why? Before the Cultural Revolution, my family had a knife. My grandfather went to France during World War I to work there. He took home as a gift. It's a family, very valuable for the family. I took it to school. And I didn't know the school didn't allow you to bring a knife to school at the time. There's no rule like that. As soon as the teacher saw the knife, he took it. And my father asked me, where's the knife? Where's the knife? He knew I was very naughty. He knew nobody else in the family took it, only me. So I had to lie. I said I didn't touch it. My father didn't believe me. He beat me again and again. So at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, I wrote a big poster. Where's my knife? And the teacher was very upset. The student was rebelling. I didn't get my knife back, by the way. But I was able to write out, where's my knife? And confronted her. I feel so empowered. I feel so empowered. And my friends and I published a small pamphlet. We use the stencil paper. You write with a iron pen, right? And you print and distribute on the marketplace. You feel empowered. You can do that. And in my middle school at the time, there was about 13 newspapers published by students. It's very, very empowering. I mean, I see these people today in China. They are the mainstay of Chinese society because they are empowerment experience during the cultural years.
Here's a question. How long did it take for the women to become free from oppression during the Cultural Revolution?
Okay. I would argue that the Chinese Revolution itself, From very beginning, it's the empowerment of women. And many people in this country criticize the Communist Party for their human rights violations. But they don't know the Communist Party was the first to talk about human rights in China, particularly women's rights. And in the early days, the Chinese government encouraged women to work, to encourage women to come to political meetings. My mom, I just mentioned her as illiterate. My mom learned so much from these political meetings in the village. He liked to listen to the government document read in the village because that taught her some new ideas he never knew before. Let me give an example. In the old Chinese society, women mostly subservient to their husband. This meeting empowered my mom. My mother always debated with my father. That's not what the government said. You cannot do that. It's very, very powerful. That's one thing. Another thing is the Chinese government helped organize a women's federation in the village. Every unit in China has a federation, women's federation. And every leadership group has a woman member. And in my village, the woman leader, every time there's a quarrel between a husband and wife, the woman leader will take the group of women to their family to fight the husband. And they really fight. They force the husband to apologize and to make amends. It's a serious stuff. The Chinese government didn't allow men to divorce their wife unless the woman agreed. That's very, very good policy, I think. Most people didn't know how much the Chinese government protect women's rights. The first thing in Chinese law, it said, the state protect women and children. Most people didn't know what that means. That means if a woman said, I don't want divorce, that means no. When there a divorce took place, everything goes to the woman. The house, the children, there's no argument.
I'm sorry, but that's not true.
That's not true. I mean, before. I'm not talking today.
No, in 1950, marriage law of 1950. He's going to have to. Gotta have the mic.
Okay. No. Yeah, later. The reason I say this, I have two colleagues when I was teaching in China. And one of my professor, colleague professor, he actually lost two opportunities, he told me, in 1985. He said in 1965, the Chinese government, Zhengzhou University, was about to send him to England to study. We were teaching in the English language department. And his wife went to the president and said he want to divorce me. And the president called him in and said, is that true? He said, yes. Then why should I send you to England? We have plenty other good men. So he was not able to go. In 1979, the Chinese had a new embassy in the U.S. for the first time. The Chinese government sent him to the U.S. as a secretary in the embassy. His wife again went to the president. He still wanted divorce. Yeah, he didn't get it. He didn't get a job. I wouldn't say there are no absolute, no divorce if the woman didn't want. But in most cases I know, if the wife said no, normally the man cannot get divorce. Their divorce was rare in China anyway. I just want to use this example as how the Chinese government protect women. I'm not arguing that's right or wrong, but they tried very hard to protect women and children. Maybe there are some exceptions, but still the Chinese government did more than most other societies in protect women and children's rights. Okay?
I'm going to take questions from the audience or comments. Let me just see. Yeah.
You started your talk with a very, very exciting observation about people not being forced to work, that people will work for social need and so forth. And I think that that's a very exciting concept and a very important concept in terms of building a revolutionary movement. But I think Mao hesitated on that question, as the socialist movement did generally in those days, and didn't go as far as the idea that I understand that millions of comrades on the left of Mao argued for the abolition of the wage system, the abolition of wage slavery, in whatever form it takes. And especially in light of the developments both in Russia and China, I'd like to see you comment on that, and with your marrying it to your earlier observation that people don't need to be forced or bribed to work for the right social causes.
I don't quite get what your main point is, but I would argue, from my own experience and from what I know about Chinese government policy towards people who refuse to work, is that people who refuse to work still get their shares of grain in the village. The Chinese commune system in the rural area, the commune is for the countryside. All the production of grain, the harvest, was distributed on 70% of the grain was distributed on a per capita basis. So whether you worked or not, as long as you from that village, you get 70% of the grain. Only 30% was distributed on the basis of how much you worked, right? That 70% was enough for you to get by. Right? In the factory, my father worked in a state-owned factory, and I know there's always one worker in that factory was not happy with the management and was refused to work, but they always get paid. You always get paid. And nobody will, I think this argument is also, for example, I think that's also a philosophical argument Mao made. In 1949, when Mao came to power, Mao made a decision to keep all the people who used to work for the nationalist government, their job. All the former state employees for the Nationalist Party were kept by the new government. When people argued, why can we afford to keep them, to pay them, right? Mao asked, can we afford not to keep them? If you don't give people a job to work to make a living, they will do something else to hurt you, right? I always argue, unemployment is the worst waste of human resources, right? Don't you think? In this country, the reason we have such a big prison population, 5% of world population versus 25% world prison population, it has a lot to do with unemployment. When people don't have a job to make a living, they do something else to get by. And that's what they can hurt society. I think there are a lot of good sense in this the so-called peasants' moral economy argument, right? You want to make sure everybody in your community survive through legitimate means, because if you don't, they will hurt you. And I think socialism is based on a peasants' moral economy model, to make sure everybody do what they can and get what they need to survive. If you don't, you dehumanize them, you dehumanize yourself. And in the capitalist system, of course, you think 5% unemployment is optimal unemployment, because that's how capitalists need in order to make more profit. But I think as a race, as human race together, we face so much environmental challenge today. I don't think we can survive as we're doing now. We need a different paradigm.
This reminds me, I just wanted, in reference to some of the questions that have come up, we are going to have 2 panels tomorrow where people will be able to get more deeply into some of these questions. For instance, we'll have a panel on the second panel about the significance of the Cultural Revolution. We'll also open up an opportunity for us to talk about issues of how do you move a socialist economy forward to minimize and overcome wage differences and to ultimately go beyond the wages system. And this is a question that might come up tomorrow. So I want to encourage people. And similarly, there are many important questions to get into about women's liberation in China during the Cultural Revolution. I mean, there was the slogan that was raised, women hold up half the sky, and one of our speakers tomorrow is going to be talking about how the Cultural Revolution challenged traditional notions of gender and what it meant as a young woman to be growing up in that period in which all the old customs and values and mores were being challenged, and very, very sharply how this was playing itself out with reference to women and their role in society, and how the Cultural Revolution was going up against patriarchy in various kinds of ways and what it meant. So I don't know, I know one of our speakers who's going to be on the panel tomorrow, I don't know if she wanted to speak at all here, just briefly in response to issues of women's emancipation. And Baidi, if you might want to say something or want to wait until tomorrow to get into that. But I think it's a very important matter. It's a central issue of any revolution, any socialist revolution, and the Chinese Revolution. Maybe you want to just say a few comments about that, because it's so critical to whether or not a socialist revolution is really going to overcome all forms of oppression.
Okay. I think I would like to say 2 things, just follow Professor Han's point. One is that the love of working, the concept. Professor Han talked about everybody should work.
By the way, this is this is Bai Di, who's a professor at Drew University. We're very proud to have her here. And she's going to be speaking tomorrow, but we'd like to use this opportunity to share everyone's insights and understanding and experience. She was someone who lived through the Cultural Revolution.
Same generation. I think that job that Professor Han talked about in a kind of an economic base, I mean, everybody should work to contribute. And I feel that it's superstructure in terms of ideology. In the Maoist China, work is encouraged, not only encouraged, but also rewarded, especially in the literature, in ideological spheres. That is, so the whole atmosphere was that everybody should be contributor to a great cause, and everybody should be to quote the Chinese phrase, that to add bricks and tiles to this communist building. Even that sounds very utopian, but then that's what we believe at that point. So I think that job, recently some people studied the literature from the 1949 to 1976. Really, work is glorified, basically. And then the work is a really happy moment, and everybody should contribute to the society. So that's the whole thing. So later on, when Deng Xiaoping talked about that economic reform, his famous words that the white cat or black cat, as long as it can catch mouse, is a good cat. And talk about, who can make more money, who is more glorious. That is totally different from Mao's idea that working itself is glorious. So workers and peasants, all these people, they produce things, they sustain humankind, so that's a glorious thing. Okay, so that's one thing, to try to say that, because the literature really encouraged that. And I just want to say that I came from an intellectual family. My father was the first to pick up to go to buy the Red Guards in the Cultural Revolution to be struggled against. However, when I was 16, I not graduated from anything, and then I was not supposed to go to countryside, but I wanted to go, so I volunteered to go. So I spent about 1.5 years in the countryside. And then some people ask me, why do you go? Because I feel at that point that you should be a contributor. And then to stay in the city and to live kind of a little bit of a privileged life was not really a kind of a revolutionary in a way. So that part, tomorrow I think I'm going to go to a little bit detail. Another one is about women's liberation. I think that you talk about the marriage law. That's really true. So after the founding of the People's Republic of China, the first law passed was not constitution, but the marriage law. So marriage law passed in 1950, the second year of the founding of the People's Republic. Really, for the first time in Chinese history, abolished arranged marriage, concubinage system, and first time gave the women's right to say the man and woman are equal partners in marriage. And also, it gives women's rights to inheritance rights. So that was really fundamental. I always compare, because my PhD is in women's studies, compare that to the Western feminist movement. So Chinese women's liberation movement was not byproduct at the same time with the Chinese Socialist Revolution. So from the top, it's not from the top down, but you can see the legal system change that fundamentally changed the concept of people. However, whether that's a huge country, China. So whether it's everything that in the law was in place, that's another issue to talk about. But in terms of law, that's really true. And also, I really want to mention in the 30 years, I mean, it's not 30, 26 years, right? And women in China enjoy a lot of things. Equal pay, absolutely. Right now, we're not equal pay here in the United States. Equal pay, you graduate from college, men and women, the same salary, okay? And the second one I really want to mention, right now we're still trying to fight for, is a maternal leave. And paid maternal leave, that's from the very beginning. I think that, yeah, so in terms of that. Thank you.
This was the Cultural Revolution, and Baidi mentions that there is the realm of ideas and values, and this is something that we're going to get into in a very big way, especially as that was reflected in art and the struggle to forge a new art that embodied a new way for people to relate to each other and to look at the world and to look at human possibility. We're going to take a few more questions. Let me see the hands from the audience. Do I see, okay, we'll go here.
You said that like education suffers if there's like teachers and professors, but like when the farmers and workers run the school, like it prospers. Do you say that? Like, do you have like concrete evidence for that?
Okay. My concrete evidence is a very good example is before the Cultural Revolution years. It's very hard for the village kids to go to primary school. Why? Because the teacher said they need to be able to write some characters and to be able to count to 100. The reason why, because there is not enough space, right? And right after the Cultural Revolution years, when the educators were in charge of education again, the first thing they did was to cut back the number of schools, right? And they argue the farmers' children don't need to go to high school. They think the farmers' children just need to know how to read and write to be enough. The evidence is very, very overwhelmingly. I wrote a paper on that. I wrote a paper called Professional Bias in the Chinese Education. In this country, in America, we don't allow educators to run education. We have a board of education, right? They are not educators. But in China, we somehow believed, Deng Xiaoping's government believed, education should be run by educators. Of course, they have to care about themselves first. The fewer the school, the better for the educators, because people fight to get to school, right? So they bribe the teachers, bribe the educators in order to get to school. There's, of course,
I'm an educator.
yeah.
I'm an educator like yourself. We're both professors of Chinese history. At the start of your talk, I was similarly impressed by your statements about human nature and how people want to help each other and want to work for the betterment of
I said
their
not
fellow.
human nature. I said that our so-called human nature is a product of social institution and environment.
Right. So, okay, so during the Cultural Revolution, everyone was working together because the social-cultural climate was conducive
Different,
to
yeah,
that,
yeah.
but not the teachers. Were the teachers different from other human beings, or did they
No.
face a different set of privileges and incentives?
During the Cultural Revolution years, the teachers were not playing a dominant role in running education. The workers, the farmers were empowered. I don't know whether you are familiar with not. During the Cultural years, the school was managed not by the educators. We have a quality workers propaganda team in every middle school and high school. And the educational policy was made by this, very similar like this in this country. We have board of educators, education, but it's a different format. The workers, soldiers, farmers actually were stationed in the school. The admission policy, the educating materials were actually decided by these people, not by the teachers. Yeah. And after this educational system, Cultural Revolution years, the people who were running education were teachers. That's why we had so many exams, right? And you had to admit there's a clash between teachers and students. The teacher used the exams to control the classroom. If you don't listen to me, think about your grade. Right? And I'm not seeing teachers are necessarily, but they need to be in the right social climate. During the Chinese Cultural Revolution years, because the social climate is different. I'm telling my teacher, for example, this teacher who took my knives, right? Had completely changed during the Cultural Revolution years. He and I worked together to build up the first school factory in the middle school. And we made cast iron products. And he actually encouraged me to teach the first lesson in the middle school. Actually, at the first class I taught, it's how was more to serve the people. That article was I taught with a group of students. So she changed too. She was completely bought into this new idea, new format of education. I'm not seeing the teacher. I mean, the reason I said that there's no human nature is exactly because he was different before. And during the Cultural Revolution, she was different too. And after the Cultural Revolution, he was also again, go back to another different format, right? And in a way, our human nature, our behavior at least, is dictated by what the society encourages, right? I strongly stand behind what I said.
You know, we're getting, how much time do we have? I don't have a watch on. Yeah, we have, so we're gonna, we have more written questions and others from the floor. Again, there are some of these issues that we'll be able to get into tomorrow some more. For instance, it's important to understand, for instance, that, Dongping, we'll get into this. One of the things that happens through the Cultural Revolution are attempts to form new kinds of leadership collective forms of responsibility, management of, not just in the factory, but also in the universities. And one of the things that happens during the Cultural Revolution are new combinations in which there's now a collective responsibility. We have political leadership, you have students and faculty, and the people that actually work in the universities as well, that now you form new kinds of collective combinations where people are taking that kind of responsibility for these base level institutions. So this is something that we can get in tomorrow. How was it that you were able to create these kinds of combinations that are, on the one hand, empowering the people who had been excluded, the workers and peasants in the past, and at the same time bringing others into the responsibility for running these institutions. So this is something that we can get into more deeply tomorrow. But it's all part of the excitement of the Cultural Revolution, because these are the kinds of things that were being experimented with and transformed. How do you? One of the main things that was being struggled with, and we can explore this, is what is the relationship between what Mao called red and expert, politics and expertise. In other words, there's the revolutionary direction of society, and there's revolutionary leadership that's needed, and at the same time, how do you draw the experts into the process of changing society? How do you go about that in a way that is actually moving society towards the goals of overcoming classes and social division? So these are things that we can explore tomorrow some more in depth. So I want to see the hands again, and back. There is a waving hand in the far rear. I want to give everyone a chance. So let's get the person back there. Hi.
Hello. Hello. I just have a comment. I have read a little bit about the Cultural Revolution, and a lot of the stuff is probably what it was not. But what surprises me is that a lot of the criticism is, made against the Cultural Revolution. They expect the Cultural Revolution it is declared, or the communist government takes over, it is declared that now it's a communist, and all of a sudden everything is, people expect the system to work efficiently, beautifully, and everything that it's supposed to have. When a child goes to first grade, there's a big transformation. The child becomes a new person. It's going to learn, become literate. But we don't expect them to begin writing essays, and analyze philosophy and religion, etc. And to me, sometimes the Cultural Revolution is expected to transform everything overnight.
Okay.
Stick with the microphone.
I don't think anybody expect, some people, when they criticize the Cultural Revolution, they think the Chinese society should be perfect at the time. Of course, no society can become perfect, can never become perfect. But I personally feel, I began to think, the Chinese rural community, the commune style of organization, is some kind of closed to a communist society. And everybody did whatever they could and get whatever they need from the community. Of course, according to Marxist theory, we need abundance. We need to see the production to progress to a level we have a huge abundance. I don't think we can ever reach that level. We will never be able to produce enough to satisfy everybody's greed. But we definitely have enough economic, productive power to produce enough to make sure everybody has what they need to live adequately, right? And from that level, I still think the Chinese Cultural Revolution on the whole, if my village, if my county was the typical example of the Chinese society, I'm very happy with it. I think it's close to a perfect society. We were poor. no doubt, compared with the United States. But we didn't have a homeless population. We didn't have drug abuse. And we have free education, free medical care. Everybody had a home. Everybody worked together. There were some problems. We didn't have crime almost. I was telling my sister at home this summer when I went back, I said, you know, that 13 years, when I was 9 years old, I started working in the village. I started working in the collective when I was 9, on Wednesday afternoon, Friday afternoon, and Sunday. Until I left the village when I was 23. I said, we didn't have one crime in the whole village during that time period. I even didn't remember who died during that time. Why? The Chinese life expectancy doubled during most time, from 35 years to 69. We were 20 years ahead of India in life expectancy, as far as life expectancy is concerned. So what do you expect? A third world country, a poor country, was able to do that much? It's surprising for me. I didn't know, I didn't understand at the time. I understand more after I left China, see what's going on in the US. Okay, when I first came to the United States, I lived in Burlington, Vermont, northern Burlington. And all of my neighbors were poor people. My next door neighbor were on welfare. And they were much younger than I was. They had 4 sons, and both were illiterate. They were drinking beer on porch every day, but their 4 children came to my house, asked me, can I have a piece of Chinese bread every day? I was so shocked. That's not the America I thought it was. When I moved to Boston, I rented a cabinet from a rich landlord. And one day he asked me, what do I think about America? I said, I'm not impressed. He was so angry. He was so upset. He was upset. I didn't realize how upset he was. He said, why? I said, because you have so much abundance, but at the same time, so many homeless people, so many hungry people. I was shocked, I said. And at the end of the year, he asked me to move, right? This guy had a daughter who was my son's age. And my son was 6 years old at the time. They have a 4-year-old boy. And his name is Edward. Oh, he said, I don't like Dongping. I don't like Dongping. I was always wondering why he didn't like me. I didn't do anything to him. So I figured out maybe that's what his father was talking at home. I hate rich people, said. He said, I have a problem with rich people. Right? And yes, I do. If there's poor people, I don't think the rich people should have that much. I had a good student in this summer, went to China with me. And he took a class with me I taught a class called the Politics of Developing State. It's about third world countries. He struggled with me from where he began the class. He disagreed with me on most of the issues. But toward the end of the class, he kind of come around with me. And this summer, while we were in China, he asked me, he told me and then to the whole class. He said, if somebody was able to help another person who was in need, and by helping that person, we're not affecting his own lifestyle, but that person refused to help, don't you think that person is committing crime? I said, that's a very tricky question, right? I said, that morally, I think that person is committing crime. He said, if you agree, then all the millionaires in this country are criminals. Don't you think? How much money do you need? You will never be able to spend the money, but it's still a lot of money. Because you are losing your money, as a result, some people suffered. Isn't that true? The Chinese government today, not the Chinese government, they released some information today. We are in a financial crisis now, right? In the world. The Chinese millionaires, their assets doubled. The Chinese government, we think it's a good thing, right? While their wealth doubled, how many people suffered as a result? I'm very proud of North China because we didn't have prostitutes, because we didn't have drug abuse, because everybody has a job, because everybody take care of. Even though we are poor, I don't feel the same way about China today. To see the environmental, right, degradation, to see my hometown, the river was so polluted, to see many, many poor farmers' children were no longer able to go to school. When poor farmers, when they were sick, they were just waiting to die. This just got me. I just feel I couldn't identify with the country as strongly as I can with North China.
We're going to take one more question from the cards, and this question is, could you tell us about how the Cultural Revolution actually started in your village?
Okay.
I think this might be talking about the Red Guards.
Yeah, the cultural started actually, there are many, I was talking before, it started with the Chinese People's Liberation Army came into the village to teach farmers how to read Morse quotations. They came in with a very fascinating format. I remember very vividly that afternoon, 3 students came to my yard, my house, and began to recite, 形. They were able to sing Morse quotations. And they sing, recite, then sing combination, right? And got me very excited. I began to read the sing with them. I taught my mom. My mom was illiterate again, right? Was able to recite several Morse quotations that time. And that's one thing. Another thing is, Mao began to receive Red Guards in Beijing. And there's one neighbor in my village who was in middle school. He was about maybe 3 years older than I was. Traveled all the way to Beijing and to be reviewed by a Mao. And when he came back, began to tell the stories, the big character poster he read on the way there, and how we should criticize the village leaders for eating more than the common villagers, things like that. And that's how it started. Many people began to write a big character poster in the village, criticizing village leaders. I remembered my mom and asked me to write down what he said in a big character poster, and questioning the production team leader, where the money he asked my family to give to him, where it went. And I look back, at the time I didn't think that's very powerful. But when I grown up, looking back, I felt that's very empowering for ordinary women, illiterate, in the village, began to question authorities. And most people study Cultural Revolution. They don't study about these kind of things. They study about how the intellectuals suffer. They never talk about ordinary people like my mom, like myself, were empowered, changed in this process. And it's a democratic revolution. It's a revolution to empower ordinary people. That's why it's different from all other Many people said cooperation was like peasant rebellion. That's how cooperation differ from other peasant rebellion in Chinese history. It's really, really empowered ordinary workers and farmers. And the people who suffered were the elite. And they need some suffering to balance